Denton Davidson here for Gold Derby, and I'm with Jessica Kingdon, director of the documentary feature Ascension. And Jessica, I just want to start off by saying this is your first feature film, and since it premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival, it's just been gaining more and more attention. You've been nominated for multiple Critics' Choice Documentary Awards, Gotham Awards. So, what does that feel like to get so much attention and praise for your first feature film?
It's a really cool feeling. It's it certainly wasn't expected for us, since in my mind I was making a small indie film, and it's rather unconventional in some senses. So for it to have the kind of exposure that it is really rewarding, I guess, to just have people responding the way they have been.
And it explores the pursuit of the Chinese dream and presents a contemporary vision of China that prioritizes productivity and innovation above all else. Can you explain to us a little bit that Chinese dream?
The Chinese dream is kind of a slippery term that's been popularized by President Xi Jinping in recent years. And it's very similar to the American dream in that anyone, if they work hard enough, can achieve a certain level of economic stability or even get rich. And I think there's a lot of similar echoes to American culture of this belief in this: if you work hard, you will be rewarded, which of course we know is not true for everyone. It is often a fallacy. In China, the I think one way that it differs is that it focuses more on nationalism and kind of a nationalistic comeback to China as a global player on the world stage.
And how did this all come about for you? What was the driving force that made you want to tell this story about China?
For me, even though it's a story about China, it's really a story also about America and consumerism and capitalism. It's sort of like a mirror of our own culture. But just going back a few steps, I'm half Chinese and have had an interest in China for many reasons, both for heritage, but also trying to understand China as this global stage for the paradox of progress. And I think that the paradox of progress is really the question of that is really magnified in contemporary China because of the vast changes it's gone through in the past few decades in terms of economic reform. And when a society undergoes so many changes, I think a lot of these larger philosophical questions about um, the meaning of work and just questions of what value is and the purpose of life, those come into sharp relief. So I think that there's a lot of echoes of American and Western culture there. And for me, it was also about trying to understand capitalism in a different context outside of the States, in a country that's still nominally communist. And I think we can sort of understand how aspirational culture and materialism operates in a more clear-eyed way when we see it in a different context. I made a short film in 2017 called Commodity City, which takes place in the largest wholesale mall in the world, which is in Yiwu, China. And so I was drawn to these physical sites of parts of the economy that are often hidden to us, but that actually drive our day-to-day lives. So in the Yiwu Mall, that's where most of the cheap made in China products come from that we interact with on a daily basis, but don't necessarily know about the people or the places behind them. And so I was interested in exploring the kind of mundane day-to-day life activities that go on here to understand these spaces that we're connected to often without even really knowing.
And the documentary is observational. And to me, that was one of the most captivating things about it because you don't interview anyone. We're watching people's lives like flies on the wall. And we see these groups of people going through different class systems. And it's sort of as the name applies. Was that purposely, the arc of the film? Because you really start with people being offered $2.99 an hour for factory jobs, and then by the end of the film, we're dealing with a little higher class.
Yeah, originally I wanted the film to be more about the cycle of production, consumption, and waste. So it was more about materials and objects. But as I proceeded, I found what was more interesting was this new kind of aspirational culture. And like I said earlier, kind of a study of materialism. Um, and so concept of ascension in terms of going climbing up the class ladder throughout the film actually really only came later, and even the title itself, Ascension, only came much later because it's actually taken from a title of a poem that my great grandfather wrote in 1912,
Mm.
which I discovered actually through making the film. I was able to discover some relatives who then put me in touch with somebody who manages a poet society that my great grandfather used to be part of. And the poem is, as I understood it, is also about the paradox of progress, even though it was a completely different era. It's in the poem, a narrator, my great grandfather, ascends to the height of power and is able to see the invading forces and feels a lot of anxiety and dread over this. So I kind of was thinking about ascension, where if you ascend to like a certain height in the economy, instead of alleviating our worries the way we're hoping for it to, it creates other unforeseen problems.
And it really does show. I mean, for me, it was fascinating just to see all of the factories, and we take so much for granted because I mean, they are making everything from the every little button on someone's jeans to every plastic bottle, and there's so much footage. And I was curious, what was it like to shoot that, and how were you able to get access into those buildings?
Yeah, so we shot in 51 locations. Not all of them made it in, but the majority did, I would say. And each way that we gained access really had its own story. But the common denominator for most of them is that we worked with different fixers and field producers in China. And because we weren't doing anything that was overtly political, there
Mm.
was nothing for us to hide. And so we were transparent that we were an American indie film crew coming to China, trying to make a film about China's economic rise. And a lot of places would say no, of course, but even
Oh,
I was surprised by the number of places that said yes and did grant us access. And part of that really is just curiosity and like a desire for cross-cultural exchange, really, which we ended up having long dinners with the factory owners, who were kind of hosting us sometimes. It was actually a really nice experience a lot of the times. And of course, the factories that we were getting access to are tend to be factories that are higher quality, where they're not like quote unquote sweatshops exploiting
right.
people and having like terrible conditions. So this wasn't really a study in the kind of like factories that are exploiting their workers in the sensationalist way, but for like everyday capitalism, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
in that sense, people really had nothing to hide. The only the challenge sometimes was because, like you said, we weren't doing interviews or filming in a sort of more conventional way. It was difficult to explain to people why we were shooting in the way that we were.
Mm.
Um, so sometimes there was some. It was hard to really, you know, get that across, the kind of nature of these sort of observational shoots that we were doing. And at one point, we actually got accused of being corporate spies because one of the factories thought that we were trying to steal their technology.
Wow.
So our fixer Jack, very intelligently was able to get us out of that by saying, look at these American idiots, do you think that they're able of stealing your corporate secrets? Which is true. Like I would have no idea how to go about doing that. So
There are some interesting ideals, though, that are shared even at those factories where I remember there's moments where someone says something like, if you worked 5 days, you only did if your manager said you did. If your manager said you worked 4 days, that's what you get paid for. And there's sort of this sense of like this need to bow down to management that really goes beyond respect for rank or authority. Um, was that surprising for you to see in any way?
yeah, yeah, definitely. I think that it was more common and more kind of out in the open than I expected, where there are these different power dynamics than what you see in maybe a typical workplace that you would be used to. But I think that kind of like what I was saying before, I think in China, a lot of these power dynamics are just more exposed and out in the open. Whereas in the States, I think that there are a lot of hidden um,
Mm.
hidden forces in terms of systems of oppression that sometimes aren't as immediately obvious. So that was one thing that I kind of appreciated, was how the rules are just so laid out bare in that way.
At least you know what people are thinking, and
Yeah.
they're open about it. So about a third of the way through the film, the jobs sort of that we're watching sort of shift and become a little less labor intensive, still working class. But there was one in particular group where it's like a military style boot camp training, and then they're also pledging their loyalty to this company. I was curious if you could speak more to filming that scene, because I've never seen anything like it before. So to me, that was a really interesting scene.
Yeah, a lot of it's so interesting how um this just comes into play, where all of our cultural norms come into question. Because when I walked into that scene of that military boot camp style training, that was actually at an air conditioning factory, which you would never know. Um, and those were employees training for, a lot of them were kind of white collar jobs, like engineers or accountants. They weren't necessarily um, physical laborers, even though they're doing this sort of physical work. It's for the like psychological mentality of just persevering. Um, but when we walked upon that scene, my co-producer Maggie Lee, who's from China, she said, "Oh, this reminds me of my freshman year of college." So that's also like a thing that freshman orientations in China do. So I think what looks kind of really bizarre and maybe over the top is actually quite common. Um, yeah, and so that was just a factory training kind of session.
Was that part of, is that part of being a filmmaker too, is, going in open-minded, and maybe you lost some of the preconceived judgments you might have, and that's just part of the work, that's a benefit.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to do with this film at the end of the day, which was, I think China's such a hot button issue and people see these sort of places and have like very strong feelings about it. But I was trying to present scenes in the film to create a space where I could present these locations to viewers and allow for them to experience it rather than to interpret it. And so a lot of it's kind of a Rorschach test where everyone takes away a different meaning from it. But for me as a filmmaker going into these spaces, I was trying to go in as much as with an open mind and trying to sort of change my mind about what my preconceived notions might have been. Like one reason why I like that scene is because even though it seems so um, militaristic and kind of bleak, you have this quick, like um, fleeting moment where these two young women at the end of the training are sort of happily skipping into the building where they're getting their fingerprints taken.
Yeah.
So I think that while the film shows a lot of moments of sort of being rigid and conformity, I hope for it to also undo those expectations in moments that you don't expect it to.
And as just sort of a last question, I'm just curious about you as a filmmaker. Where did you get your inspiration to go into this field? What made you love film?
Hmm. Um, I think that film has this sort of, and documentary film in particular too, this way about sort of being able to interact with reality and then filter it through your own lens and find a way to discover something new that maybe was out there before but you just never really saw. So for me, I think with film it's a tool for me of discovery, really.
Well, congratulations on this mesmerizing documentary, Ascension. To our viewers watching, head over to goldderby.com, make your awards predictions, and check out more interviews with top contenders. Jessica, thanks again for talking with me today about your film, Ascension.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.